top of the hour, so we are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Carson McPherson-Krutzke, and I'm a research associate with the Natural Hazard Center at the University of Colorado Boulder. I am so happy to welcome you to our Making Mitigation Work webinar series, which is hosted by the Natural Hazard Center, and it's also been made possible through support from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, as well as the National Science Foundation. This webinar series was launched in 2019 and highlights recent progress in mitigation, policy, practice, and research. I want to share a few announcements before we dive in. This webinar is being recorded. The captioned video recording and the presentation slides from today's webinar will be posted online at the Natural Hazard Center website, hazards.colorado.edu. This is also where you can go ahead and find recordings from past events, as well as gain access to many other free resources that we have. So please do go ahead and check those out after our meeting today. In a few moments, I will turn the controls over to our speaker, but if at any point during the presentation you have a question or a comment, please feel free to submit those in the chat using the chat function or the Q&A box. I will be monitoring those throughout the session, and we will bring those up at the end for some time for Q&A. Additionally, thanks to partnership with the International Association of Emergency Managers, or IAEM, and attending the webinar makes you eligible to receive 1 contact hour of emergency management training through IAEM. To receive this credit, though, you are required to attend the entire webinar session. If you fulfill this requirement, you can go ahead and email us at hazardcenter@colorado.edu to request your certificate. And you can also visit the Making Mitigation Work webpage under our trainings tab at hazards.colorado.edu to learn more about how to do that. Now, I am so excited to introduce today's webinar, which will be a briefing on the launch of the 3rd assessment of natural hazards. Today, we will be hearing from our very own director, Lori Peek, who will provide an overview of this 3rd assessment, which will be the first large-scale update of the state of hazards and disaster research in the US since 1999, when Disasters by Design and the companion volumes were published as part of the 2nd assessment. So you will soon be learning about this assessment as well as opportunities that you can get involved in it. So it is now my absolute pleasure to introduce Lori Peek, who is the director of the Natural Hazard Center and a professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Colorado Boulder. Peek also leads the National Science Foundation-funded Converge facility and the Social Science Extreme Events Research Network, or SEER. She has written several award-winning books and numerous journal articles. In addition, Lori envisioned and established this webinar series with our partners at FEMA, and she is very excited to join today as a speaker, and we are so happy to have her. So I will go ahead and turn this over to Lori Peek. Lori, your sound is not working for some reason all of a sudden. We tested it before and it's not showing. Let's try this again. Try unmuting.
Okay, how is that
There we
working?
go. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Carson. And thank you so much to everyone who's joining out there today. I'm seeing many old friends from across the US and even around the world. And it is great to see you and great to see many new faces today as well. And so I am going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, and Carson, can you just confirm really quickly that everything's looking good with the screen share?
Looks great.
Okay, thank you so much. And thanks to you and Jeffrey for everything you did to set up the webinar today and to make this possible. And so as Carson said, my name is Lori Peek, and I am honored to serve as the director of the Natural Hazard Center here at the University of Colorado Boulder. And I'm also a professor of sociology here at the university. And I am absolutely thrilled to be joining you online to provide this briefing on the launch of the 3rd assessment of natural hazards. And for those of you who were at the Natural Hazards Workshop this past summer, I actually had an opportunity to provide this briefing in person to almost 200 people during the natural hazards workshop. And that was absolutely phenomenal. And we received so much really helpful and really supportive feedback at the natural hazards workshop. But we also recognize that many people were not able to be there in that room. And we are thankful for these virtual events that allow us to reach many more people. And so this briefing that I'm going to give today is very similar to the one that I gave to the in-person audience at the workshop, with some critical revisions that are being put in place, because during the natural hazards workshop, I had the opportunity to actually collect paper feedback forms from the attendees at that session. And I've read through, processed all of the feedback that was provided, and have used that feedback to help to inform and update the briefing that I'm going to deliver today. And so in that spirit of collecting feedback and wanting to hear from every voice in the room, we're going to go with an online form to meet our online setting. And so if you have your phone in front of you, you can use the QR code that is on the screen right now, or if you're at a computer, if you could type in hazards.colorado.edu/TA_form. And again, that's hazards.colorado.edu/TA for third assessment _form. And if you could go ahead and open up that form, I'd like you all to please take a minute to fill in your first and last name, your email address, your affiliation, and then if you would please share in a sentence what motivated you to sign up for this webinar session today. And so we'll take a minute for you all to get into the form and to fill that out. If you could please keep that form open for the duration of the session, and no worries if you mistakenly submit it. You can submit more than one form, but I'm going to ask you to keep this open throughout the duration of the session, because as you will see, there are a couple of additional questions on there, but I'd actually like you to complete those once you've heard the briefing in its complete form. And so please do keep that form open. And I wanted to share a little bit about why I opened the session in July and why I'm opening the session today with this question. At last summer's Hazards Workshop, we heard from Danielle McNutt, who works here in Boulder, Colorado on wildfire mitigation activities. And one of the very many compelling things that she said during her remarks at the workshop was related to how she enters a room or enters a landscape when a family or a community has invited her or her colleagues in to do wildfire mitigation assessments. One of the things she said that she has learned is, rather than just walking in and beginning to hit people with facts and directives on all the things that we should be doing to mitigate wildfire risk, that she starts with that simple and elegant question of, why did you invite us here today? What led you to reach out to us, to Boulder County Wildfire Mitigation? Why did you reach out to us? And she shared that through that simple act of beginning with a question, that it actually has improved their mitigation activities profoundly in terms of listening to why are people inviting them into the room, and that helps them to know where to begin with their conversations around mitigation. And so I really have tried to follow in Danielle's footsteps, and anytime I'm talking about this, to try to understand what is it that's really brought people into the room, physical or virtual, to learn about this new initiative. So thank you for filling out that question and that form. And I wanted to briefly share a little bit of my own story about what's brought me to this point. And so many of you will recognize that face that is up there on the screen. That is Professor Dennis Milletti, who served as the third director of the Natural Hazard Center here at the University of Colorado Boulder. And Dennis was my mentor and advisor here at the University of Colorado. And when I began as a brand new graduate research assistant in August of 1999 here at CU Boulder, so 25 years ago and some months, I walked into Dennis's office. I was a new research assistant at the Natural Hazard Center, and the first thing that he handed me was a copy of Disasters by Design. And in Dennis's highly recognizable cursive script, he wrote, "Lori, welcome to Boulder and the Natural Hazard Center, Dennis." And that moment was such a crucial moment in that Disasters by Design had just been released, just really, I think it was days or weeks prior to my arrival at the Natural Hazard Center. And so Dennis's office, I can still see it in my mind's eye, was sort of scattered with boxes of these books that were literally hot off the presses. And over the coming years, as I was a graduate student, I witnessed Dennis as he traveled across the United States and even sometimes around the world to share the message of Disasters by Design, the key messages, the key findings. And it had such an impact on me on seeing the influence of the work, and in particular, seeing the impact that it had on our community in terms of bringing researchers and practitioners and policymakers together. And so that is in part why I'm so excited to share with you today more about the launch of the third assessment of natural hazards. And so our objectives for our time today include that I'm going to provide some more history and context for assessments led by this particular community in the hazards and disaster field. Also to describe the purpose, motivation, and scope of the third assessment, as well as to explain in more detail the structure, planned approach, and also audiences that we hope the assessment will serve. And then I'm going to provide a more detailed review of the working outline as well as the outcomes for the assessment. And then critically discuss possible ways for those of you who are joining us online to get involved in this assessment. And so what is an assessment? This summer at the workshop, I had a few people stand up and share what it was that brought them into the room. And a fabulous graduate student at the University of Delaware, he stood up at the back of the room and he said, "I'm here because I actually don't know what an assessment is, and I've never been a part of an assessment. So I wanted to come into the room just to learn, what is this all about?" And that was so beautifully said and provides a needed foundation for the discussion we're going to have today. So some basic definitions of what is an assessment include that it's a summary, it's a review, it's an analysis, it's a report. And so sort of in the most flat-footed terms, as I'm going to share, it's really a taking stock. It's an assessment of something. But we also know that an assessment might also, and often does, involve an evaluation or a judgment on the value, quality, or impact of something. And so sometimes assessments really are just the what is, but oftentimes the best assessments also entail the what could be. What could we improve based on the gaps, or what do we need to continue? And so to that end, the way that we are really defining this third assessment is sort of jumping off, making specific to our field, is that this assessment will involve a taking stock as well as a synthesis as of the past, as well as the present state of knowledge in the field of hazards and disaster research. And it's also going to entail setting a research as well as critically an associated applications agenda to drive the future of the field. And so I know that it's very important to start with the why. Why are we going to take this on? Because I do recognize this is going to be a large, multi-year, monumental undertaking that is going to involve the entire community or many members of the community in some form. And so let's talk about why are we going to do this? So first and foremost, as Carson mentioned in the introduction to this webinar, the last national assessment, Disasters by Design, appeared in print in 1999. And so this year was really the 25-year anniversary of Disasters by Design. But we all know in the time since, the threats that we face have become increasingly complex. The number of people, places, and assets that are affected by natural hazards, as well as compound, complex, and cascading disasters, is at an all-time high. And the amount of research that has been produced has also grown dramatically in this field. And so, again, many of us in here, and all kudos to Adam Smith and his team at NOAA, we've all seen this graphic and many other graphics that many of us put up when we're doing presentations and trying to talk about what's happening with discrete hazard types, as well as with disasters writ large in our nation and beyond. But another graphic that I think is equally important to include is really related to concurrently what has happened with the state of our field. And so this is from a paper published in 2021 by Wolbers and colleagues that took stock of 20 years of crisis and disaster research. And this graphic, I think, does a really good job of capturing sort of the monumental growth in the field, the growth across different phases of the disaster cycle. But what it doesn't capture, but they talk about in the paper, and we also know, is that these many journal articles that have been produced over time, and this is just one sort of segment of a set number of journals. There's actually many times more articles that have been produced across the field over the past 20 to 25 years, that these articles and books and reports and the gray literature, it's scattered across so many different sources that it's very hard for any one person or even a small group of people to sort of get their arms around the state of the field. And to tell a brief story about this that I told at the workshop that I always remember Dennis told me. So Dennis was a graduate student when he worked with Gilbert and the team on the first assessment of natural hazards. And Dennis told me this story about that Gilbert came into one of their meetings around the first assessment, and he talked to Dennis and he said, "Dennis, you're going to be responsible for reviewing the literature on risk communication." And he pointed to a shelf in the Natural Hazard Center library, literally one shelf that was the risk communication literature at the time in the early 1970s. And Dennis said, I was sort of quaking in my boots and thinking, how will I possibly ever review all of that literature? And then fast forward to the 1990s, by the time the second assessment was taking place, not only would the risk communication literature fill an entire shelf and an entire bookshelf, it would likely fill an entire library of moderate size. And then again, fast forward 25 more years, and you all can imagine exactly how much just that one segment of our literature has grown. And so again, this idea, this first part of the why, that it is time, it's past time for us to really come together to take stock of what is known in the field. Second argument for why we need this third assessment is that understanding this body of available research can improve the possibility for its practical application. This idea that by assessing what we have learned, we actually have an opportunity to apply it to improve the safety, health, vitality, and resilience of the nation is really at the heart of this undertaking, that we are not just doing this scholarship for the sake of scholarship. We're doing this scholarship to ensure that it is applied, again, for the benefit of humanity and for the current and future stakes of this generation. When Ashley Ross filled out her form at the Natural Hazards Workshop, she said that I hope we're going to do this because it might have an impact on my child's future. And so really thinking about that deep why for why we're doing this. Additionally, by applying an inequity lens throughout this assessment, we're really hoping to advance this a lens that will ensure that we're centering these concerns across disciplines and across dimensions of hazards and disaster research. Third, this assessment is also going to set a forward-looking research and applications agenda to inform the next generation of hazards and disaster research and evidence-based practice and policy. And we've already got some great feedback this summer because there were many practitioners and policymakers in the room with some ideas for how we can move that assessment of the research literature into the hands of practitioners and policymakers. So more on that during this briefing. And then fourth, this approach to producing this assessment will ensure that it is inclusive, transparent, and replicable. And so importantly, I know that I do not want to wait another 25 plus years for another assessment to come out. And so some of what I'm going to share during the briefing today is going to be related to some of the processes that I've already put in place to ensure that we're documenting every step of this along the way. So whoever picks up the reins and starts riding this horse for what we hope is going to be the fourth assessment in much less than 25 years will actually have a replicable process to follow. And we also are really committed to ensuring that diverse members of the field, and so here we're talking about demographically as well as functionally diverse members of the field, will have various opportunities to participate, which is ultimately going to only strengthen the final product and its reach. And so now I'm going to give a little bit more history for those who may not be familiar or those who are familiar but might need a refresher on the first and the second assessment. And so the first assessment of natural hazards research was led by geographer Gilbert White and his colleague Eugene Haas, Gene Haas, who is a sociologist. And so they brought together a team of, in particular, graduate students here at the University of Colorado Boulder, as well as many of the nation's leading experts who they brought in for a series of meetings focused on different hazard types, such as floods, landslides, earthquakes, volcanoes, and other natural hazards. And so that assessment was completed and published in 1975 and had a major impact, as I'm going to share, on the field and in particular on the formation of the Natural Hazards Center. And then the second assessment, which was led by sociologist Dennis Milletti, appeared in print in 1999, but it's important to state that in addition to the publication of Disasters by Design, which is widely known as the second assessment of natural hazards research, he referred to it as a reassessment following on Gilbert and Gene's work. The second assessment was also accompanied by 4 other volumes that were published also by the National Academies Press, or the Joseph Henry Press at the time. And so this included Paying the Price, which was led by economists Howard Kunrether and Richard Roth. Cooperating with Nature, which was edited by the urban planner Ray Burby. American Hazardscapes, which was led by geographer Susan Cutter, and then Facing the Unexpected, which was written by Kathleen Tierney, Mike Lindell, and Ron Perry, so 2 sociologists and a psychologist. And so different disciplinary perspectives being brought across these volumes that appeared as part of the suite of outcomes for the second assessment. And it's also worth noting that in addition to these 5 volumes that you see up here that were published as part of the second assessment, there were also numerous journal articles that were published as part of the second assessment. I'm going to give another example. My friend and colleague and collaborator, Alice Fothergill, was a graduate student under Dennis Milletti's tutelage during the second assessment. And Alice had a very similar story to the one that Dennis told about how Gilbert directed him to review the literature on risk communication for the first assessment. For the second assessment, Dennis walked at his fast speed that he always walked at into Alice's graduate student office, and he sat her down and he said, "Alice, there's this burgeoning area of research on gender and disasters, on race and ethnicity and disasters, poverty and disasters. I would like you to take stock of the state of the field in those particular areas." And so Alice, sort of like Dennis, said, okay, challenge accepted, but this is going to be a big undertaking, and undertake it she did. And Alice ended up writing the seminal 1996 paper, which I know is one of the most cited in the history of the International Journal of Mass Emergencies and Disasters, on the state of the field on gender and disasters. Then she worked with colleagues on a companion paper on the state of the literature on race and ethnicity and disasters, and yet another companion paper on poverty and disasters. And so Alice anchored all three of those publications. And so this is just one example of a multitude of the sorts of additional outputs and pieces of scholarship that have really became foundational to a whole next generation of our field. And so with the first assessment of natural hazards and with the second assessment, I'm going to say a little bit more about who was involved. But first, I want to say something about the impacts of those volumes. And so each of these volumes really offered fundamentally new paradigms for the field. This cannot be overstated how important these volumes were in terms of driving our field forward. And here I have pictures of the first and second assessment, those two volumes, but also want to include the other volumes and outputs that came out of the first and second assessment. And since we're on a webinar dedicated specifically to mitigation, I want to kind of tease out some of the mitigation focused outcomes from the first and second assessment. So in the first assessment, nearly every chapter in the first assessment is concerned with what Gilbert always referred to as human adjustments to hazards. And so I see Risa Palm, one of Gilbert's longtime collaborators and mentees, is joining this call today. And as Risa and others can attest, that Gilbert, of course, his work was never about fundamentally trying to control nature. In fact, his work was antithetical to that. It was thinking about how do we live in harmony with nature and with the natural hazards that are a part of our natural world. And so with the first assessment, many of the chapters are profoundly concerned with considering the different adjustments to specific natural hazards types and weighing the potential costs and benefits, not only in monetary terms, but the human costs and benefits of these human adjustments to natural hazards. With the second assessment of natural hazards in terms of the paradigm that from the outset, Dennis and his many collaborators were quite concerned with advancing, was what Dennis came to refer to as a sustainable hazards mitigation approach that was holistic, interdisciplinary, and took careful stock of the natural, built, and social environments, and really thinking carefully about that. We also know that both the first and the second assessment were deeply concerned with how we can bring together multidisciplinary as well as interdisciplinary research perspectives. And as always, Gilbert was quite clear-eyed when writing about the importance of this, but also the difficulty of bringing together researchers across disciplines. And so one of the things he wrote in the preface to the first assessment was, it was far easier to bring together the methods of a variety of disciplines than to integrate them. With various degrees of success, we tried to provide a more solid groundwork for examining opportunities to improve the national situation by research in many relevant fields, ranging from the geophysical measurements to studies of personality and community response to stress situations. And so when you really read the first and the second assessment with that lens, you can see how profoundly they shaped where we are today in this field in terms of integrating across disciplines and even moving into more transdisciplinary spaces. Other impacts include that, as I alluded to, the first assessment actually inspired the creation of a new institution, and that institution was and is the Natural Hazards Center. And so the first assessment was published in 1975, and the Natural Hazards Center was actually founded in 1976, in part in one of the recommendations that the graduate students, I understand, in particular, really pushed as part of the first assessment, that they argued, and it's documented in Gilbert's biography, that he was actually a little reticent about founding a whole new institution, but the graduate students really advocated for the fact that if we are going to bring researchers and practitioners and policymakers together to reduce the harm and suffering from disasters, then we need a national clearinghouse that would serve that purpose. And ultimately, Gilbert relented to the graduate students, and the Natural Hazards Center was established in 1976. And so creation of at least one new institution, but also many new publication outlets were established as a result of the assessment. So for example, I know many of you on this call have published in the Natural Hazards Review, which is an American Society for Civil Engineers, or ASCE journal. And my understanding is, I know for a fact that the Natural Hazards Review came out of one of the recommendations from the second assessment. And I understand that was actually one of the first journals, or maybe the first from ASCE, that the co-editor lead was a social scientist, that was Dennis Maletti, and the other editing lead was an engineer, Jim Beavers. And so that was really, again, a foundational new outlet for many of us to be able to publish our multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary research then as well as now. We also saw the new publications coming out of the Natural Hazards Center, as well as other institutions that followed the publication and recommendation of the second assessment. And we have also seen many other structural changes in our field related to funding processes. So recommendations about having more explicitly multidisciplinary calls within the field, as well as the formation of additional centers and institutes that have really proliferated in the decades since 1999. Both the first and second assessment brought members of the field together around a common purpose. That the idea from the start with those two assessments, as well as with this one again, is that no one person, no one small group of people can accomplish what needs to be accomplished with an assessment of this scale. And so we need to be working together. And also importantly, that these assessments trained generations of researchers and really helped to keep what the National Academies report in 2006 referred to as core researchers. So people who have dedicated their lives to scholarship in this area. And so the assessments both played a vital role in training those researchers and sustaining their commitment to the field. And Bill Anderson has been credited with sharing the following missive about the people who make the assessment. One of the things that was attributed to Bill, or perhaps Dennis Winger, or maybe both of them, because they were both our National Science Foundation program officers for a very long time, that one of the things that they were known to say about the assessments was that as important as the impacts, the scholarly impacts, the scholarly contributions of the first and second assessments were, that really perhaps the most important impacts of those assessments was that, again, it was the people who were involved in those assessments and their opportunity to provide scholarly leadership, to provide mentorship, and to bring in new generations into the field. And so regarding the first assessment, there's actually very little that has been written about, or that remains, to my understanding, that's still documenting the writing of the first assessment. So if you are out there and you have information or knowledge about the first assessment, I would love to know more. And in fact, I have interviewed several people who were involved in the first assessment to learn from them. But if you have more information, please contact me. But from what I've been able to piece together from the assessment itself and some of these interviews was that over 200 staff, as well as students and reviewers and workshop participants, were involved in the creation of the first assessment of natural hazards. So while Gilbert and Jean took the lead on ultimately synthesizing and writing all of that information, there were many other people who they brought here to Boulder to have conversations to help inform the assessment. And then again, many, many graduate students such as John Sorensen, Mike Lindell, Dennis Maletti, and others worked directly on that first assessment. And then when it came to the second assessment, Dennis, actually at the very front of Disasters by Design, the first couple of pages are actually dedicated to listing out 132 contributing authors who joined working groups or otherwise contributed to the creation of the second assessment of natural hazards. And so on this page and on this note about who were the people, what was the process for creating these assessments, this is where I want to pause and dig a little deeper on the importance of really documenting so that we can replicate and improve upon this process of the third assessment. So if you were alive in 1975 or working at that time, you can think about how the first assessment was written on a typewriter. And so again, much of the documentation that would have existed as part of the first assessment, unfortunately, has been lost over time as records have been moved or placed in various places. When it came to the second assessment, it was of course generated on a word processor, but it was generated on a word processing form more perfect that Dennis and Mary Fran and others used to use, that unfortunately many of those documents related to the second assessment were also lost over time as we transferred to other computer programs like Microsoft Word, and as other documentation was lost. And so one of the really important things that I've already established with the creation of the third assessment is that we have multiple tracking platforms for who's contributing, who's doing what, who's responded to what, to ensure, again, that there is a clear documentation for how this process unfolded, and also to ensure that the people who are contributing receive credit. So let's dive in to the third assessment. And so now what I want to do with the time, I'm going to talk some about the scope of the third assessment and so forth. But first, to orient you to the assessment itself, I actually want to walk through in some detail the assessment and the outline of the assessment. And this outline, as you'll see when I present the timeline, I actually spent a couple of years interviewing people involved in the first and second assessment, reviewing those documents and also related documents to begin working on this outline, which, as you're going to hear in a minute, has been reviewed carefully by a steering committee who I'm going to introduce in a minute, and also by several other trusted colleagues, and also lots of feedback provided this summer at the workshop. And so in terms of the third assessment, final title to be determined, but for right now, just referring to it as the third assessment, it will open with a summary of key findings and recommendations, which is obviously critical to have a short bottom line up front with a summary that will recap the key findings and future recommendations for research as well as application. So the vision is that this will be, again, very brief, a short series of pages that can also be reproduced in other outlets. This will be followed by an introduction to the assessment that will establish the purpose, scope, and approach for the assessment. So why are we taking on this assessment? What is the background in our community in the hazards and disaster field in terms of advancements that we have made as a field, to a real taking stock in terms of the advancements since the first and second assessment, but also critical eye towards the strengths as well as the limitations or gaps that are opening up because of our rapidly changing natural, social, political, and economic environments. The introduction will also establish the scope of the assessment and the hazards and disasters that will be addressed. And so while the central focus of this assessment, as labeled, will indeed be on natural hazards, we will indeed address major geophysical hazards such as earthquakes, volcanoes, avalanches, landslides, as well as pressing weather and climate-related hazards such as drought, floods, hurricanes, wildfires, heat waves, cold waves, and tornadoes. And this chapter, however, and importantly, will include recognition that will be threaded throughout, that these natural hazards are profoundly influenced by other other issues of public concern, and that there are many other disaster types within our community that are closely connected, sometimes overlapping, cascading, and co-occurring. And so examples of some of the other topics that will not be as central in the assessment, but will be addressed to some degree include consideration of industrial accidents and technological disasters. So much to be learned, especially from the cascading and compounding natural technical disasters, terrorism, cyber terrorism, and acts of mass violence, as well as pandemic and public health emergencies. That was something heard loud and clear at the workshop this summer, a real desire, especially as COVID-19 continues to impact the US in such profound ways. And then also a consideration of interlocking social crises such as poverty, homelessness, drug use, affordable housing shortages, and unhoused populations, as well as climate-related migration. And so some of these deep social issues that are also a major, and social pressures that are also a major part of understanding how and why disasters unfold as they do. And so the introduction will also briefly describe the structure and the approach and the audiences for the assessment. Now, from here, I'm getting ready to do a brief summary of the 10 chapters that are envisioned in the assessment. And I'd like to ask you all, I know that it can be difficult to pay attention in an online environment, and I thank all of you who are still listening carefully. And here I'd like your ears to really perk up carefully, because at this point is where I'm going to describe the 10 chapters where we will be bringing in additional co-authors into these chapters. And so if you, in that form that I shared earlier that we're going to return to, express an interest in being a chapter author or contributor in some kind of way, I'd love for you to listen deeply here about what chapter most resonates with you, or chapters that you might like to be involved in or to contribute to in some way. So chapter 1, tentatively titled Disasters in the US. And so the intent of this chapter is bring together leading data scientists and researchers to take stock of what we know about disaster losses by hazard type, region, and decade in the US. This is important to state in terms of the scope of this assessment, which I'll share more about. This chapter will also include some future projections as available regarding what is likely to happen in the future with, for example, heat waves, wildfires, severe storms, and other hazards. And importantly, rather than just sharing the numbers, these data throughout this chapter will be contextualized through discussion of the root causes driving disaster losses, and humanized through sharing the stories behind the numbers. And so this is where you're going to hear in a moment that I'm going to be asking for case studies and other contributions from members of the community, so we have those stories behind the numbers from the outset of this assessment. This chapter is also going to discuss how certain seminal disasters, such as Hurricane Katrina in 2005, Hurricane Maria in 2017, and the COVID-19 pandemic have shaped the trajectory of the hazards and disaster research field. Chapter 2 is tentatively titled Counting the Cost, the Rising Toll of Disasters. And so this chapter is going to tackle the 3 Ds of disasters: deaths, damages, and dollars lost. And as with the prior chapter, it will, when the data are available, summarize past trends as well as future projections across the big Ds that often appear when we're trying to get a handle on the state of disaster losses. And so throughout, attention is going to be paid to disaster disparities and the unequal impacts of these events. And the chapter will draw on the best data available while also identifying data gaps and needs. And each section will include various case study vignettes and, again, stories to ensure that we're helping to illuminate these trends and patterns related to the Ds of disaster loss, damage, and deaths, as well as injuries. Now, chapter 3 will tackle the enduring societal consequences of disaster. And so one of the things that we know and recognize is that our current approaches to assessing disaster losses undercount and therefore do not fully capture the true harm and suffering caused by these events, especially for those who are at the margins of society. And so this chapter will take a life course perspective and offer a new, more holistic framework for assessing the enduring consequences of disaster and cascading disruptions that often ensue. And so this chapter will consider both how societal decision-making shapes disaster losses and in turn, how disaster shapes society. And so this is where this chapter in particular will be taking stock of what we know about, for example, the short as well as long-term impacts of disaster on mental and emotional well-being, physical illness and hunger, household disruption and dysfunction, evacuation, as well as long-term to permanent displacement, community division, as well as possibilities for restoration, memorialization, and cultural change, among other topics. Chapter 4 will be dedicated to the topic of understanding risk and resilience, exposure, vulnerability, and capacity. And so this chapter will draw carefully on approaches to understanding disaster risk and resilience as rooted in interactions between the natural, built, and social environments. And it will also, and already been encouraged to also add technical environments. It will also offer additional contextual overlays to understand shifts in other spheres of social life. So this chapter will adapt a systems perspective to underscore critical linkages between exposure, vulnerability, and capacity that help illuminate processes that drive disaster risk and resilience. Chapter 5 is entitled Mitigation Matters, Reducing the Impact of Disasters. And so this chapter is going to take stock of mitigation research in the hazards and disaster field with a focus on land use planning, engineering advancements, but also while entertaining more recent calls for bolder climate adaptation measures, nature-based solutions, as well as equity considerations and concerns that are beginning to be documented in terms of the mitigation sphere, in terms of uneven adoption of building codes and standards, not just at the household or local level, but also at the state level, unequal allocation of mitigation funds in the community at the state level, loss of insurance in at-risk places among socially vulnerable and environmentally vulnerable communities. And also importantly, in this chapter, we're going to try our level best to document losses averted. And so that ultimate timely question of when did mitigation work and how and where and when have we documented this as a community so we have those success stories to turn to as well. Chapter 6 will take on the topic of cultures of preparedness with a major nod to the Culture in Action Disaster Network, or CADEN, who've really pushed this idea that there is certainly, in a country as big and diverse as ours, there's no one culture of preparedness, but it's important that we take stock on the literature of different cultures of preparedness. Here, looking at things like risk perception, risk communication, household and organizational preparedness efforts, and other topics. And so in this topic, we'll also be looking at topics such as actionable risk communication, equity considerations, and concerns in the preparedness space. Chapter 7 is titled State of Emergency, Responding to Disaster. And in this chapter, we're going to, as the title suggests, we'll assess the research body on the emergency response period of disasters. And so this is where we're going to be tackling questions related to crisis communications, improvisation in emergency response, mobilizing supplies, resources and responders, mutual aid, evacuation, mass sheltering, debris management, mass fatality management, and many other topics of concern in that emergency response space. Chapter 8 will be dedicated to the incredible growth in the study of long-term recovery in the aftermath of disaster. And so while this has long been characterized as the most understudied phase of disaster, that is no longer true in 2024. We now know that this has changed dramatically over the past 2 decades, and this is a real chance for us to be able to assess the state of recovery research that's available at the individual, household, organizational, and community level. Also, this chapter will tackle how we plan for, do or do not plan for recovery at these different scales, and will provide case examples of community restoration, as well as will question this idea of recovery for all, bringing again that vital equity lens to this chapter. For chapters 1 through 8, each of these are going to end with research takeaways as well as research gaps. And so there's going to be a sort of a common framework for each one of these chapters to ensure that there's consistency across the chapters. And that again, we are taking stock of the current state of the literature, but we're also always keeping an eye towards what do we need more of. Chapter 9 is a new addition to the assessments, although is a following on to the important 2006 National Academies report Facing Hazards and Disasters, which did include a really important chapter on the state of the research workforce. And so this chapter 9 is going to be dedicated to both the state of the research infrastructure, and so what physical as well as social infrastructure do we have here in our field, and what do we need in terms of centers, institutes, laboratories, federal research programs, funded shared use facilities, and other infrastructure. But this is also going to take careful stock of defining the dramatically growing workforce, why the workforce matters, and what we know about the size, diversity, and capacity of the research workforce. And then chapter 10, this is going to do our level best to wrap this all together. And so currently titled The Future, Convergent Hazard and Disaster Research. And so this chapter is going to summarize the common threads woven throughout the assessment, while also making a series of key observations concerning where research has been applied, where it needs to be much more forcefully applied, and what research is still needed, as well as what supports are needed to ensure research, evidence-based policy and practice uptake, and the future of the field in terms of the need for additional collaborations across boundaries. And so in addition to the chapters that you just heard about here, this is one of the questions I received this summer. We're also going to have several appendices, and in order to ensure we don't bog down the book too much, it's likely these will appear online and be interactive, but we will have appendices such as definitions of key concepts with important citations to where those concepts are coming from, because often there's not just one concept of concern. Definitions of key concepts, data sources that were used in the creation of the assessment and data sources that are needed, other resources that were generated as part of the third assessment. So really a living repository of all the different outcomes that we hope will emerge. And then also there'll be documenting disaster, writing the third assessment. What was the process, again, with this eye towards replication, so we don't wait another 25 years. And so there will also be acknowledgements woven in all throughout to, again, not just document the process, but the people and organizations and the ways they have contributed. We'll also generate chapter-specific bibliographies that will be available online, again, hoping to help foster that next generation of research, because there's no way we're going to be able to cite every single publication that informs the assessment in the book itself, or the book would be much too big, but we will ensure that each of the bibliographies are made available online, and that there's a chance for feedback for additional contributions. So the scope of the assessment, a few words on this. And so literature and time. This assessment will attend to foundational literature, as well as review the peer-reviewed literature, so journal articles, books, book chapters, as well as select government or other report between 1999, again, sort of following the end of the second assessment, to 2026. In terms of geography, the focus of this third assessment will predominantly focus on hazards and disasters that are affecting the U.S. states, territories as well as tribal regions, but also at all times will include this recognition that issues are global and therefore findings from other regions will be integrated as possible and appropriate. And we hope this also might spark collaborations in other countries around the world where other assessments may be taking place, such as Canada. In terms of disciplines, this is a social science-led assessment that will integrate perspectives from public health, engineering, the physical sciences, and humanities. And in terms of the hazards and disasters that will be covered, I covered this in my spoken remarks and know that these slides will be available online, but this really gets at that there will again be a core focus on natural hazards, but also a consideration of these other co-occurring overlapping types of hazards and other hazard types that inform our knowledge in the natural hazard space. In terms of structure and approach, I will be leading this assessment along with the fabulous Natural Hazard Center team. And this work will be guided and already has been expertly guided by an 8-person multidisciplinary steering committee, including Divya Chandrakasar, who's a regional planner, Shade Dashti, who is a geotechnical engineer, Jim Kindra, a geographer, Avi Lyle, a structural engineer, Michelle Meyer, sociologist, Monica Schock-Spana, an anthropologist, as well as an expert in public health, Eric Tate, a geographer, and Tricia Wachtendorf, also a sociologist. And we had a chance to meet with the steering committee earlier this year here in Boulder, Colorado. You can guess the time of the year by the dusting of the Flatirons with snow. And we had an absolutely incredible meeting with this group to help to move the assessment forward and receive critical feedback on the outline that you heard about today, as well as on the other dimensions of this assessment. And so thankful for their support as well as their intellectual and heart contributions to this. And so in terms of how are we actually going to do this, as I noted, the assessment's going to include a summary, intro, and those 10 chapters that I outlined. And I'm going to serve as the lead overarching author of the assessment itself to ensure that common voice and continuity across the assessment. But then each chapter is going to involve one lead chapter author as well as 2 co-leads. And so these 3 persons working in concert are going to take primary responsibility for producing the chapter on time. And then we'll have approximately up to 7 chapter co-authors for each of these chapters to help write the text. And the co-authors are going to be chosen with a consideration for technical expertise, disciplinary and functional diversity, demographic diversity, and also career stage, so early career to senior scholars. And so this is just kind of giving a summary of what this is going to look like, that there'll be the summary and the introduction that I'll draft, but then with each of the chapters, there will be 10 or perhaps more authors involved in each one of those chapters, so involving somewhere around 100 persons who are contributing in that way. And just wrapping this up, because I know we only have 4 minutes remaining here, so I'm bringing this to a close to get to your ways to get involved. And so ways to get involved in this assessment plus time commitments involve as a chapter co-author. And so after hearing this briefing today, if you are possibly interested in helping to co-author one of those chapters, which would indeed be the most time-intensive investment, please mark that down on your form that we shared at the beginning of this, and the QR code is up on your screen. And Carson will share that in the chat as well. There's also going to be an opportunity to be a contributor, so to provide scholarly references, data, case studies, or other inputs. And so we'll do those through forums and open calls to the community. A reviewer, where you review and provide feedback on the detailed outline or chapter-specific outlines or even the full assessment. A funder, supporter, or champion. This is a big undertaking, and so people who want to support in other ways are welcome. And then also, if you're envisioning right now some other role where you might want to contribute to this assessment, we hope that you will go back to that online form and put in there what you're most interested in or which areas you'd most like to contribute to. And so just finally, a few words on documentation and process. Why this is so important is we want to make sure that all the people who help produce this assessment that this is meticulously documented again, because we want to make sure that proper credit is given and to encourage that future replication. And so I've already set up a share drive that we'll be using to ensure collaboration. And we'll also be using templates for the different chapters to ensure as much consistency as possible across that writing and clarity in terms of the voice and the outputs. And so we'll be asking things like, what is the existent knowledge? What elements of that knowledge base have stood the test of time and are still valid? What elements of the knowledge base have been modified or refuted by recent research? Or what is being challenged by the changing climate, social, technological, or other forms of change? And where are the fundamental knowledge and data gaps that we need to pursue as a community? And so the audiences we envision for this include scholarly audiences, students. We hope to shape a whole nother generation, researchers, leaders, and team members in different research centers, as well as other audiences such as practitioners, government funders, journalists, and others engaged in public communication. And last but not least, what is this all going to lead to? So the possible outputs, for sure, there's going to be a third assessment, one volume as envisioned here. But we also hope that, like with the second assessment, additional volumes will be issued. There will undoubtedly be journal articles. There will for sure be bibliographies that are produced. We also, much of the feedback we received at the Hazards Workshop was related to how can we ensure that research to practice to policy loop. And so having briefing papers that are co-created or co-authored with practitioners or policymakers, one-page PDF summaries, brochures like the one that was created as part of Disasters by Design and mailed out to every member of Congress in the United States. And then lots of other educational and promotional possibilities, such as curricular materials, videos, podcasts, and so forth. But that's all going to unfold over time as we begin this critical work. And so we have a timeline here that I'll share as part of the slides, but in short, we're hoping to have this assessment complete by 2028. In terms of acknowledgements, where they are certainly due, the Federal Emergency Management provided support for the launch of this third assessment, which is gratefully acknowledged, as is the ongoing support of the National Science Foundation for this effort. And with that, I hope that you will all make sure you remember to submit your form so that we get a record of this. Any comments, questions, concerns you want to share, please use that form for those purposes. And thank you so much for staying with me for this hour today to hear this briefing. And with that, Carson, I'm going to say thank you to everybody on here, and a special thank you to you for leading this series, and turn it back over to you. Thank you. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Lori. I am just so impressed of that comprehensive overview that you just provided, and we're so grateful to have that. And I'm so excited for everyone online to hopefully get involved in this excellent project. So I do want to just add a few reminders here at the end for those of you who can stay on an extra minute or so. You are able to get continuing education credits. And so please do visit our website to get that. We also want to again thank FEMA and the National Science Foundation for making this webinar series possible. And we're so grateful for you all for joining today. And it's just been amazing to see how many people wanted to listen in and hopefully participate. Additionally, we will have another Making Mitigation Work webinar next month. So I hope you will join us on December 10th from 11 to noon Mountain Time to learn about what is happening in the world of mitigation practice and research. And that one will be titled Rethinking Housing Resilience: Lessons from Post-Disaster Research and a Way Forward, and will involve Tracy Kajewski from the Structural Extreme Event Reconnaissance team. Additionally, for those of you who may be interested in attending the Hazards Workshop this coming summer, which will be our 50th anniversary workshop, very exciting, we hope that you will apply for the Disability in Disasters Award that supports people with disabilities working in disasters, as well as those who care for, study, or advocate on behalf of those with disabilities. This award will fund a recipient to attend the Natural Hazards Workshop and researchers or practitioners meetings that follow. So we hope you will also apply for that. The deadline for that is December 2nd. And with that, I just want to say thank you to Lori for the excellent presentation. Thank you to everyone who attended today. We're so grateful, and we will hopefully see you all next month. So thank you so much.